Welcome to my podcast, Gerben.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Maybe a short background of you. We are talking today about LLM summarization. And what is your background in IT LLMs that we can talk about this?
Originally, I'm a physicist. I have been an IT engineer, architect, designer, a strategist for almost 40 years. Sometimes my own company, sometimes I've worked for government, I worked in the private industry. And next to that, I'm an author speaker. I have spoken a lot about the difficulties and the ways you can manage complex IT landscapes. All the large organizations, especially, have very complex, large IT landscapes, and they are very hard to change, to maintain, to keep secure, to develop, to innovate, etc., etc. And that complexity and that difficulty, that has been my career. Next to, I've always been a writer, so I've been a kind of a tech journalist-like writer. I've written 2 books. One has a 5th edition now. That's a book about about a modeling language, a very technical book about a modeling language to kind of model these complex landscapes. And the other one is more a managerial book. It's called Chess and the Art of Enterprise Architecture, and it's about kind of more the process of making good design decisions in complex landscapes and in complex organizations. My first actual real job was still at university at an AI institute. I didn't go on in AI, but it kind of gave me a lifelong interest in keeping, on the level with what was happening in AI. So about, I think 3 years ago, the organizers of the Enterprise Architecture Conference Europe asked me, we know you have that background. Could you make this clear to all these enterprise architects who have no idea what's going on under the hood? Can you tell them what to expect of this? Can you educate them? And that made me dig very deep I tend to dig deep. I tend to, dig about 3 spades deeper than what I write. So I went in very deep in what's going on here. And I read the last 3 years about 150 scientific papers. And then started blogging about it, gave a presentation on the conference, did a Dutch version on it. I've recently been a co-author of a new paper that's coming out in March of the use of large language models by students during education in, say, the law faculty in the Netherlands, which is a very kind of a linguistic study, right? It's all about language. And there's a lot of difficult decisions to make about the use of large language models in those kind of settings. So
I will put the links under the video for the books, and then when it comes out for the article.
Yep.
And we started to contact you, or we contacted you and wanted you on the podcast because we read an article on your blog about summarization of LLM and the capability of those LLMs to summarize texts, because we help students write. So we advise them, not ghostwriting, but we coach and advise them how to write scientifically, master thesis, bachelor thesis, doctor thesis. And we see in those scientific writing space that many people rely on summarizing papers with AI. So, and we saw on your article that this is not such a good idea to rely on AI summarization. So my question is, maybe we start with that. How are LLMs summarizing and how are humans summarizing? What is the difference?
Okay. When I wrote that article, that's, I think, more than 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, maybe even 2024, I think. All right, so about 2 years ago.
May 2024, yeah.
Yeah, 2024. Things have changed since then, but not fundamentally. So LLMs work in a certain way in that they start with some input. That's your prompt, plus whatever, the vendor is putting in front of your prompt. And your prompt. And then it starts to generate. And people think they generate words, but they don't. They generate tokens. Say approximately in English, you have roughly 3 tokens to a word. Sometimes a token is a whole word. Sometimes a word consists of 4 tokens.
Yeah.
But they calculate on the basis of these tokens. And what they do is they calculate at every moment, they calculate a set of statistically likely next tokens. That can be single characters, that can be a whole word, but that can be a dot, that can be anything. And from that set, they pick one at random. They glue that behind what is already there. So everything that has gone before, the prompt of the vendor, your initial prompt, their reply, your next prompt, their reply, everything in the history is taken as input. And the farther away it is, the less effect it has. So distance is important.
Yeah.
And then they calculate the next token. And they do that in the same way. They calculate a set of potentially okay tokens based on statistics, glue it again at the end, and start over again. That's a system that would run without end. So one of the tokens is end. Don't generate anymore. So if you're halfway a word with tokens, the end token has a very low probability. But for instance, if you have typed before, give a short answer, and the last token was a dot, then suddenly the end token has a high probability. So there is no understanding of what is going on linguistically or meaningfully in those systems. It's all a statistics on token. I sometimes use the comparison that it's like you do a statistical analysis of ink distributions on paper, and from that try to create meaningful language. Now, that's a very old comparison, by the way. It's from a Dutch author in the 19th century. So that's very, very, very old. But what happens is this process, and I can kind of show you an example if you like, so visually. Maybe I can put something on screen if you like.
Yes, show us how the tokenization works.
Okay, well, first I can show you what happens with, what happens with, so you see this, right?
Yes.
So here's an example from my talk in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
I give a question, a prompt, what word describes a shortage or scarcity? And then the machine starts to calculate the first token, and out comes a P. So it then puts the P at the end of what is already there and starts to calculate again. Now, if you start with a P, the word want, which is also scarcity, can no longer be created. So it's very unlikely that, say that and as a token is added to P to produce pant. So what happens is that this process goes over and over again. And then the next one is awk. It's kind of glued behind. This is called auto-regression. Then the next one is itty. All these things, as you can see, awk has no meaning. There is no meaning to the token awk. Awk has no meaning. So the calculation of these systems is totally without meaning. Even if tokens are accidentally a word, they are still, from the perspective of the machine, just a sequence of characters. And then after itty, the dot gets a high likelihood because we have a kind of a complete word, right?
Yeah.
And then after that, this is of course a synthetic example because these systems are chatty. You can easily get a whole page of text if you ask a question like that. I tried it yesterday. I asked Gemini to do the same. And I say, give me a single word answer. What is a synonym of scarcity? And then it came up with paucity. And I did it another time. It came up with dearth and etc. So this is how it works. So this is the mechanism. These tokens are what these systems produce. They don't produce words. Now, let's stop sharing. So these tokens, and I have an example for you. Let me share that as well. I'm not very fluent in Zoom, sorry.
No problem.
Okay, there it goes. So here you see a lot of synonyms for scarcity.
Yeah.
In alphabetical order. So you see, for instance, shortage and shortfall and commonness and undersupply and whatever, limitness, etc. Now, if you ask, there is a tokenizer from OpenAI that you can test what kind of tokens come out, both GPT-3, 4, or 5. So this is GPT-5. And this is how it looks. So you see the word DARF, if that is produced, is a D and then Earth. Earth is a token. Earth is an interesting token, of course. It's a word in itself, but here the meaning is not Earth, right?
Yeah.
And you see that, for instance, for inadequacy, insufficiency, and infrequency, in is a initial token, insuf is an initial token, and inf is an initial token. So these neural networks, they run once and produce a single token. And they do that over and over again. That's called recurrent neural nets, and that is already in existence since the early 1990s. What happened in 2016 is that Google found a way to massively scale this up. So the technology is actually 30 years old. But there was an engineering trick by Vaswani who has changed everything, because suddenly it became possible to actually train extremely large models. And that was not possible before. So this is more or less how these models work with text. Interestingly, by the way, they also work with numbers that way. It's very interesting because we don't do numbers with little pieces of text that consist of 1, 6, 3, 5, 7, 8, etc. But the models do that. So they can't actually calculate. And this is actually to bring down the fact that these models don't understand what they're doing. But what they're doing is a very effective or very powerful, which we never had before, approximation of understandable results. So what happens here is a split has come into existence between understanding and producing understandable results. These systems don't have the understanding, but they can approximate the results of understanding without having understanding. It's pure statistics on ink droplets. It's statistics on tokens.
And how is it measuring the statistics? So when you ask this question that you put in the prompt, how the LLM knows or how they can statistically measure what would be the most likely token?
Every token is represented by a very complex number. So a simple number is, say, 0.92. If you have a number that's a coordinate in the plane, you have 2 dimensions. So you have 2 values in one number. That's what the mathematicians call a complex number. In 3-dimensional normal space, you need 3 coordinates, right? 3 numbers to have 1 coordinate. These tokens all have 12,000 roughly dimensions. So they are represented by 12,000 numbers, simple numbers. And they come in the input you give them and everything that has produced before and as a further distance away. So what happens in the calculation of a new token is this. First, for every token possible, and the modern systems may have a token dictionary that has 200,000 tokens. They go every of these 200,000 tokens, they're going to calculate that given what is there in the input, that's called the context, and based on the configuration, so the parameters they have created from what's called training, then you get these very simple, but it's our simple algorithms, but work with enormously complex numbers. And they do something very simple. They say, okay, I'm going to calculate, and that's what's called the intention mechanism. The previous one, the previous one, the previous one, and all these together are taken into account for every of these 200,000 tokens. And out of this comes a statistical likelihood that that token is a good token to follow up with. So, for instance, if you had that first sentence and you had the first P, then dot will have a very, very very low likelihood, because in the material it has been trained on, P dot is not a normal answer given at all, let alone if you ask it what's a synonym for scarcity.
Maybe
So,
here
so there is an enormous amount of calculations. Sorry, go ahead.
How are they trained, those models?
Let me add one more thing. So they calculate this set of possible next tokens, and then a very important thing is they pick at random one of that set. And that's where the creativity comes from, because every time you ask a question, you get a slightly different answer. In terms of this word, you get one time it says positive, the next time it says Darth. That because the next time the first token selected at random from that set was D. If you remember the picture of these different tokens, then all the initial tokens example were in the initial set. And then it selects that at random, and that's where the creativity, but also that's where the hallucinations come from. Because it doesn't understand what it's doing. It's doing statistics on the order of tokens. It's not like reading a book. It's like statistically analyzing the character or the ink droplets on the printed page.
It's like throwing a dice.
At the end, there is a lot of calculation to create a set of good possible next tokens.
Yeah.
That is deterministic, right? That set is deterministic. Then, at random, one of these are taken and put behind what's already there. And then it goes over and over again until it produces the end in the set as a likely one. And then at random, it is selected as well.
So it is some sort of, when I, for example, asked this question that you showed us, then it is some sort of, it takes all the possible answers to this question.
All the possible next tokens to what's already there.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with a question, a remark, or whatever. It just has to do with the order of tokens that goes on and on and on and on. Token after token.
What I want to understand is there is a training behind this.
Yes.
And then the system detects, okay, scarcity in this sort of sentence.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't detect scarcity because it doesn't know scarcity. Scarcity is probably also multiple tokens.
Okay, but the tokens that make scarcity.
Yeah.
Then it calculates, okay, what other tokens are statistically
likely
to come after this.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
This entire range, right? Not just the last token, but everything that has gone before. Thousands of tokens. So it's 200 times thousands. So you're talking in millions. And then you're talking 12,000 dimensions. There's a reason why this is so extremely expensive to calculate, and why why they are building these large data centers. Now, you were asking about training, and I don't like the word training because it's kind of puts people on the wrong foot. But what happens is that's in two phases. The first phase is and that's why it's called GPT, right? It's a pre-trained transformer. Transformer is the technology invented by Google in 2016. Pre-trained means you put in an enormous amount of text where all this ordering is in. Reddit, Wikipedia, all the books you could steal or validly use or whatever. And you have an enormous trillions of token sequences, which can teach you about the likelihood of the order of tokens. And that happens by the first initial thing is that they put in the text, and part by part they remove the one token. They let the system calculate what the system thinks should be there. And if it's wrong, they adapt the parameters in the calculation a slightly little bit so that the good answer that should be there, because they remove that out, becomes a little bit more likely. And they do that over and over again, trillions and trillions of times. And they do that numbers of times after each other, and they end up with an optimized set of parameters that kind of contain the patterns that are in the enormous amounts of text. It's kind of a compression, a lossy compression, you could say. And people call this training. And that gives us kind of the idea of that something like human training is going on. But that's not the case. What's going on is it's configuration. You have all these parameters, and they have to get an optimal value for this statistical token prediction process. Now, I have to say that they do the pre-training based on those texts. And then there is a lot of what they call fine-tuning, where they have all these special prompt and answer things that the system should replicate truly. And these have been used to make their system helpful and harmless and honest and all the things they want to do. They thought in 2023 they could actually make the systems honest, helpful, and harmless with this fine-tuning, and they soon found out this was not the case. So since then, all kinds of things are built around this fundamental technology, and even sometimes very simple. In 2023, you could still see them, right? So if you put something in, you could get a warning box, sorry, and this was not large language models, it was just a string. If you had a string terrorism in it, it would kind of flag it and say, no, that's against the policy. Something like that. The simple, stupid technology. A lot of stuff has been built around, and the systems have become more complicated in the sense of, if you think there is one answer generated for you, that's not true. Even fundamentally, a number of them are done in parallel side by side. Again, make 8 side by side, the whole process becomes 8 times as energy inefficient, right? And especially the so-called thinking models, they don't think at all. I've also written an article about that, because what they do is they have not been trained on actual answers, but they have been trained on forms of answers. And what happens then is they do a couple of things. It goes too far and too deep to go into that now, but they do a couple of things where they produce tens, hundreds, or maybe thousands of continuations in a process to, in the end, come to the actual continuation they present you. And that's the reason why they want to build all these data centers. That's not for training. Everybody says training these models is so expensive, but you train a model once, and out of that comes, say, 500 billion parameter values. But you calculate that once, and you use them millions of times. And it's that production, which is called inference, that is so costly, and that's why they are building the data centers. It's largely for production. And that's also why, for instance, Google has now gone a little bit ahead of OpenAI, because they're using different, more efficient hardware so they can put more power into these inferences.
So what is so costly is this constant calculation
of 200,000 possible tokens against tens of thousands of tokens that have come before, using a formula which is pretty simple, but has, say, 300 billion parameters. And that is for every little token, that whole thing, billions of calculations, happens for every single token again and again and again and again and again.
And maybe in comparison to that, how is the human, I don't know if you can answer this, but how is the human brain coming up with answers?
So we should probably move that a little bit back. It's a very good question, right? But you were asking about summarization.
Yes.
Now, having said all of this,
yeah,
what happens with summarization?
Okay, all right, yeah.
Summarization means that at the one hand, you have the text you put in. Please summarize. That's all an enormous amount of tokens.
Yeah.
Right? It says, please summarize, then all the tokens. Then this calculation happens with the parameters based on the tokens, and token after token comes out. Now, what I found out when I did the experiment in 2023 was that it's kind of a tug of war between, on the one hand, the parameters, right? And on the other hand, the tokens that go in. So if I wanted to let it to summarize something on a subject where there is a lot of available on the internet, the input I gave it was totally ignored because the parameters overwhelmed the input.
So what was before there?
Yeah, because the calculation is the combination of the input and the force of the parameters. And if you try to, say, summarize something of which there are millions of examples available on the internet, they will already very strongly have influenced the parameters, which means that that little bit you put into it has very little effect.
So sort of the training data, if you say training data before.
Yes, the training data via
the little text you put in.
Yes, the training data overwhelms via the parameters, the input you give it.
Yeah.
However, if that what you put in is hardly available in the training data, then something else happened. And what I saw happening was that there was not a real summary. If we do a summary, then what we do is we understand what's written there, and then we make a summary. So the example I gave in the blog post was, suppose you have a part where you have, say, 35 sentences leading up to a conclusion sentence, number 36, and about 4 after with some caveats, etc., etc. Then if you go to shorten this, it's very likely that the whole conclusion drops out. Because what happens, what I saw happening was not so much summarizing, but shortening. So either the parameters, the training data won from the input, or the input was mostly shortened. And shortening can be successful, but that's an approximation. Shortening is, just as all the other stuff is an approximation of understanding, shortening is an approximation of understanding. Now, in 2023, this was very easy to show. 2024. It gets harder because these systems get better. They get much more costly to run. So they get better at it. But the fundamental problem of not understanding remains there. And the funniest thing of the example I used was it had a summary paragraph. So I put in a system which has a paragraph summary. Now, you and I, if we understand this and we are asked, give us a summary of this paper, that's easy, copy paste, summary. Yeah. Because the authors already have created a summary. But a system that is going token for token in this and doesn't understand actually what a summary is, and it has to go it in a roundabout way, shortening it in a way that approximates a real summary, that's going, that's really unreliable. Now, since, say, about 2 years ago when I did those experiments, the systems have improved, but the fundamental issue is still there. I should say the fundamental issues are still there. That you can get stuff in your summary which was never in the paper, but which was in the parameters. That you can get a shortening which kind of removes the essential conclusion. So it's a very inefficient way to produce understandable quality information. And I don't say it's useless, because it's very useful, but it's not of a very high quality in terms of understanding. And that's where we get to the humans, right?
Yes.
So we humans, how do we trust something? And for instance, if you talk with somebody and that somebody has very good language, right? They have good sentences, good words, good arguments, etc., etc. That's in a lot of what happens in our minds are mental automations. Those are shortcuts. So I tell you something. How long do you have to think about having an opinion about that? That's like this, right? There's a speed here. It goes in 100 milliseconds. It's only 20 watts, and it goes immediately. So what happens is that a lot of the things we have learned are automated, just like computers, but quite differently. Get to that maybe later. So what happens is that we have all kinds of shortcuts in our minds. And one of the shortcuts we have, that if the text is intelligent, the output is intelligent, then the person who has produced it will be intelligent too. If the text is a very good paper, then we say this student is a very good student. Now, what the large language models have done by approximating good results without having the understanding that was always needed to do it, they have broken that assumption. So what happens is that when we are confronted with these systems, we are thoroughly impressed, and we experience intelligence. Why? Because we never have learned a situation where there was intelligent output without an intelligence to produce it. So in our minds, there is this absolute kind of link, automation, that tells us this is intelligence, even if it isn't, because we have trained ourselves to use these kind of shortcuts. Somebody comes by and he says the earth is flat. So are you going to take that person seriously? No, you're not. Interestingly, by the way, on average, these people are quite intelligent in an IQ sense, but they have their convictions. And the conviction says the earth is flat. So that gets us to human psychology. We have convictions, which is a part of our mental automation. One of the convictions is intelligent result comes from an intelligent producer. And that's no longer true. We have intelligent results that don't come from a intelligent user. So this flat earth person, if they are confronted with facts or reasonings that say, come on, that's not true, and you give them the facts, it doesn't work. Why doesn't this work? Because our convictions have a much stronger effect on our observations and reasonings than the other way around. We think that our convictions come from what we see and what we think, what we reason. That's not true. Most of it is copied. Most of it is kind of shortcuts we have created to actually be able to be so fast and so energy efficient as we need to be as human organisms. Mm-hmm. I walk in high grass, I see something orange there, and if I start to think orange, that could be a tiger, right? So orange and black could be a tiger. Before I finish thinking, I'm toast. So we have to be automated. And we have the same problem in human automation as you have in all IT. That is, automation gives you high productivity, but it is very hard to change. So it's very hard to change our convictions because they are what make all kinds of things possible. And by the way, we are also a cooperative species, which means that if my neighbor that I have to hunt with every day has a different idea of what he wants to do, we're not going to catch anything. So our convictions need to be stable too. It's an evolutionary necessary that our convictions are stable. Now, all the convictions that we have brought up to this point, where we have the large language models, kind of predispose us to see what is happening there as intelligence. And you can be extremely intelligent in terms of cognitive talent. You can even be a Nobel Prize winner, like Geoffrey Hinton. And you can be an utter fool here. For me, Geoffrey Hinton is kind of a flat earther here, right? He thinks that he thought, and Ilya Sutskever of OpenAI, who now has his own firm, he once said, how do you get artificial superintelligence? Well, you go to the large language model, you say, give me an answer as if you were a superintelligent. Now, he is so convinced that this construction that is inspired by human neurons, but is so far from it, does the same thing as the human brain does, because this has neurons, their system has neurons, so they're equal. My favorite philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, would say that's bewitchment by language, because they're so fundamentally different. But they both called neurons. So that's bewitchment by language. And the end of this is that we are predisposed to misinterpret what's going on. We experience intelligence, and then we ascribe intelligence. And sometimes we ascribe consciousness, we ascribe personality. And the vendors know this, by the way. One of the references in our article references what Sam Altman said when they have to call back a version of GPT that was considered too sycophantic, because people hated it, that it was so sycophantic to you. You always get this positive feedback. What a great question. And what a great critique, etc. That's all psychological. And he actually literally said, the default personality of GPT influences very much how much you trust it. So they know this. And what they are doing is kind of engineering that trust, because that trust gets you people coming back. Yeah. They deny this, by the way. We don't do this to hook people. I have my doubts about that. I think they know pretty well what they're doing. And if I may make a little aside, why do we have these internet influencers these days? How do people actually come to their convictions? Well, there are two very important things. One, if the information you get, if you don't already have a conviction, because that's hard to change, it's something new. If the information comes from close by, family, friends, tribe, then it's almost automatically accepted. And the things that you see or hear often also are accepted. Now, what does social media do? These influencers, they are on your screen. They talk to you as if you are a friend. They don't know you, but that's how they talk. And the algorithms of social media give you the same over and over again, preferably something extreme so that you come back. But it's the same over and over again. So these systems are inherently destabilizing society. Why? Because they make use of the fundamental ways in which we get convictions, which is by closeness and by repetition. Exactly is what they are doing. Yeah, if you are an influencer, you have to put a post up every day. You have to write every day. You have to make a vlog every day, etc., etc. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the content of what you say, but the repetition of it and the closeness. They are in your face. They talk to you as if it's a friend. That hacks directly into fundamental automated mechanisms of our brain.
Okay, let's maybe go back to the AI and intelligence. So maybe you can, maybe not. Could you give a definition of what is real intelligence?
Now, I've written one of my posts about this, so maybe you could put a link on this. Okay. But the best one so far in this discussion I've seen is from Francois Cholet. He was originally from Google. He wrote a paper called On the Measure of Intelligence, with a lot of kind of smart mathematics in it. But actually, it comes down to this. Intelligence is if you are able to adapt to something you haven't seen before and find out and learn about it. So, and this is something the systems we're talking about are really, really not very good at. But we as humans, we have the capability to see new patterns, learn new patterns, etc., try things, etc. So the flexibility, and Cholet has a very nice definition of that. That he says, the acquiring a new skill. So it's not about the skill itself; it is about acquiring a new skill in a very efficient way.
Okay.
And the reason that's important is because the large language models, the Gen AI, if you test it on a single skill, even if it's math or it is something, etc., you can kind of you can outcalculate this. You can put so much calculation energy into it that you can get at the same skill level. Good example was, for instance, AlphaGo, which beat the best human Go player. And then somebody kind of said, well, what if I put some really stupid amateur moves in it? Or he did some calculations to find these. And the system lost. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was trained on very good plays. It wasn't trained on amateur plays. Now,
Right.
That's a very interesting example of how there is a difference between actually doing good at a skill and actually understanding the skill you are doing. Now, I've written about that too, a lot about what's happening with benchmarks in AI. They are meaningless almost, right? And they are, people select them in benchmarks and talk about it, and they can do the math Olympiad and they can pass the bar, etc. All these things are designed for a system where you can only produce the good output if you understand the content. But now we have these systems that can produce the good output without understanding the content. And you can kind of power them so much that even without understanding, they might pass that exam. That's not intelligence. There is a difference between having a skill and being good at a skill, and especially narrow skills, right? Because AlphaGo cannot play chess. You could teach it chess, but then it cannot play Go anymore.
So the term artificial intelligence is wrong.
No. I don't, we have biological intelligence. And by the way, as far as I'm concerned, we both overestimate this and underestimate it. So the human intelligence is much overestimated.
Okay.
But the technology that is needed in the brain to actually get to that level is hugely underestimated. But no, artificial intelligence, we are intelligent, quote unquote, machines. I don't think we are very intelligent, by the way, because if you look around it, we are making quite a mess of it, right? So before we say that humankind is intelligent, I would say, show me. But given that we're the most intelligent on this earth, that I would agree to. We are intelligent, but also stupid.
Maybe for writing and science research. For what tasks is ChatGPT and other LLMs and AIs? For what tasks? Let's stay in the thesis realm. Students can rely on ChatGPT and AI, and for what tasks they shouldn't.
Okay. First, you can never rely.
Okay.
So that's easy. Rely is not possible. However, they're quite good at being finding you stuff these days. Because if I want to find, there was this article I heard about, and it was about this, that, or that. What was that again? That if I ask that Gemini finds me the article, right? So Should I then only read what Gemini says, the article says? No. What I do is I download the article and I read the article. Somebody went with me in a discussion on one of the Substacks I think it was the Gary Marcus or the Paul Krugman Substack, I think Gary Marcus. And they had put my critique to Claude, or something I had said to Claude. And Claude had given a reply, no, it's kind of, there are productivity gains from large language models, and this is the famous paper about it. Now, it happened to be that I knew this paper. I had this paper. And I had kind of this paper, even I had said it, I recall a paper that's really weak, right? And it goes too far into why it was weak, but it was a really kind of weak proof. And actually, the author said it was a weak proof. But Claude says, no, there is this paper has held up very well. That's because there are many people on the internet said, this paper shows there is a 15% gain in productivity, whatever, by using large language models. So Claude hasn't read the paper. It hasn't understood the paper, but it knows about the paper because there is so much text about this paper on the internet, including the paper itself. And then it says it has held up well. Where? So you cannot rely on the answers the large language models give you. But, and this is like at the start of the Industrial Revolution, not everything has to be perfectly good as long as you know that it doesn't have to be good. For instance, when the Industrial Revolution started in the physical automation, they were able to produce much more cheaply these kind of fabrics that the artisans had to produce very expensively. So that's where cheap comes from, right? Because cheap has two meanings now. One meaning is it's cheap. You don't have to pay a lot. The other one is the quality is cheap. So cheap used to be you don't have to pay much, but then physical automation came in, and cheap meant you don't have to pay much, but the quality is not very good. It has taken us centuries to get to machines that actually are better at precision, etc., than humans, and only in very, very narrow areas. So what this kind of AI boom is doing is like it did at the start of the Industrial Revolution. It introduces the category cheap, and that has value. We all buy cheap clothes and cheap things and cheap stuff and etc. That has a real value. So I can use this stuff, use it for stuff I already know things about, mostly, because that enables me to actually recognize where it goes wrong. But even then, it's a dangerous thing. So you have to be very careful if you do this. I never let AI write for me.
Why not?
I would probably never accept it, what the output is. And it would be more work and less fun to repair a beige, middle of the road AI answer into something that is fun to read. Because if you are a writer like you're sort of, in part, also an entertainer. People should not fall asleep if you give a presentation, and people should enjoy what you write. So it should be fun. So I write to entertain the people. That's one of the things I do, next to that it should be 3 spades deeper than what's actually written. So I like writing. That's probably the best answer.
Okay, but of course there are many I say students, they don't like writing.
Nope. and that's why these systems are so seductive.
Yeah.
And what happens now is that and that's what our article is about, that yes, it is painful. writing. Sometimes it's repair. I have had one blog post years ago that took me 3 months to write, because all the things I have to look up and all the things I have to, do I say this correctly, etc., etc. So it's painful. It's also very satisfactory if you actually have done it. So you also, it's like running, right? If you go running, it's painful, but you also get the endorphins that that you have done it. Go sporting, etc., etc. So it's not only painful, but the most important thing is the only way we learn something is by doing something. You can't learn to sing by listening to other people sing. You can't learn to write by letting something else write for you. It's not how you learn. So that's the big danger of this, because we are used this connection. A good paper means intelligent writing has gone on. So what we have created is a situation where one is a reliable measure of the other. Good language is a reliable measure of intelligence at the other side, or at least intellectual agility, right? And that's no longer true. So what happens with students who have too much of cognitive offloading of the pain they have to experience, because no pain, no gain, that they actually produce this paper, which maybe is very good, gets a high mark, and gets their diploma. That's like, putting a heroin shot in your arm and feeling yourself extremely good, because you have learned nothing. And that's actually what comes out of some research that put also people in MRIs, where they actually could see that these people were not developing themselves. So what happens if you actually use these large language models? Well, you can at this moment, because we are living in a system that is still built on the assumption that a good result is a good producer. That's no longer true if you use that system to produce the result. So we have to adapt. For me, I think I should teach in the first year of university. I should teach students by using the systems how middle of the road it is, how everything looks the same, the errors that are made, etc., etc. And then I would forbid to use them until they have enough knowledge to actually productively and safely use them. But they have to go through. And if the universities don't do that, if the universities don't take the writing seriously, the mental development that actually comes by writing, because you don't learn something by reading it, you learn something by explaining it to somebody else, to communicate about it, to have to put your understanding in words, etc., etc. So writing is an active learning experience. That result isn't that interesting at all. It is about that process.
Well, for most of the students, the result is the most important thing. They say, I'm not so interested in. Well, there are many that are interested in learning, but there are some that say,
Yes.
I just want to pass. I just want to have my thesis and get my grades or my title. Here is just what we experience is that it's very risky, that we have some clients in our coaching that used to let their thesis write by AI, then they failed. And now they say, okay, that's too risky for me. I have to do the work myself. And some still try it, not the same people, but other try to.
No, and universities have to adapt. So if you get as a professor a thesis, then you will have to have an interview with the student and see if their knowledge actually is in their brain or only in the paper. So it's not that hard. So university will have to adapt, but you can actually help the students, and by the way, they did a survey in the Netherlands at Erasmus University. I think 60% of students were in favor of forbidding the use of large language models to produce your papers and your thesis, etc., etc. So yes, there are many who say, I don't care if I have the diploma, I can get a good job. But what's the risk for the universities? If you are a university who is not strict on this, where's your reputation 10 to 20 years from now? If you are a university that is very strict on this, and after 20 years it turns out that your students ended up being the best people out there. So this is a long-term effect. For the students, it's a seductive short-term effect. And they damage themselves, just like the COVID restrictions has damaged a lot of students, because it was very difficult to get good education at the time.
Well, I see the long-term effect, but I see the short-term effect too, because I see this in real time with our people. When they, for example, we had this case right now where a person tried to write an expose with AI. I think she even searched the papers with ChatGPT and then let ChatGPT put this all together. And then the professor said, wait, what you are writing here and what is in the paper doesn't go together, doesn't match. And sometimes how you showed this with your summarization, that there are just wrong information.
Yep.
What I heard from other professors too, that when they read something, that they, from logical understanding, that they say, wait, this cannot be right. And then they start to doubt, and then they start to interview the person. So there's always the risk that this output is just wrong.
Yeah. And there is the big risk of, if you use automated systems for detection, that you get false positives. So people who have actually written themselves get marked as being, this is an AI production, which is very unfair. Which means that indeed you have to do this. You have to do this interview thing. So if you make very sure at the end that you have to do the interview thing with your thesis, that it's going deep, and you explain to the students that during the years before that, if they don't practice in doing that, they're going to fail at the end. I think they will fail at the end if they do that. I think students will learn that it's a very bad idea to hand in somebody else's work, because that's what you're doing. Again, I like to use once a week, twice a week, depends on. Sometimes it's 10 times a week, sometimes it's weeks, nothing. And I'm also, of course, testing these systems, right? So I'm playing with them to see what they do, etc., etc. But it's really impressive technology, and sometimes it improves my productivity a lot. But only there where I already have a basis, a good basis. And if you don't get the good basis, you never come into the position. Suppose we all are going to drown in AI slop, right? What Harvard called work slop. How are you going to repair the slop? Then you need understanding. How is anybody able to repair that if they did not develop the understanding? So in the end, even if we will get a lot of AI generated information, it will require humans to actually make sense of it. And if we don't have the humans capable of doing that because they have actually learned to understand the underlying stuff, then I would say we're in deep trouble.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe one last question, or one last question. The other question we already covered. How do you see the future of AI, or maybe will there ever be an AI that really has an understanding and the intelligence and the consciousness that a human has?
Sure. Why not? if kind of we can do it, can you do it with digital technology? I would say a definite no.
Okay.
Can you do it with other technology? I would say yes. Do we have the technology? No, we have no idea. But if you know about things, how the brain works, which is at the edge of chaos, which is all kinds of nonlinear stuff, which is all, it's amazing. I read yesterday that the eardrum you can detect sounds where the eardrum moves in picometers, which is 1/100th of the width of a hydrogen atom. Now, that is amazing. And I can tell you that everything in the biology, after 4 billion years of kind of evolutionary development, is so. There are things that are not good, of course, that could be better, but this is so impressive how powerful it is. And as long as we don't have something as powerful, which you will use a lot of things that we cannot do in digital computers. That's why we are building quantum computers, for instance. So with digital computing, I would say no go. If you add analog, there are already some examples. If you analog and kind of elements that don't work with whole numbers, but with reals, then I would say we would be able to improve our artificial intelligence a lot more. But then again, I have to repeat, I said it to you in the earlier, everybody who predicts the future lies, even if he's telling the truth. Personally, I think we are at this kind of for AGI, we are there where the alchemists were in the 15th century. It's going to be centuries. It's not going to be years. It's not going to be decades. It's going to be centuries. Talk to me in 200 years.
Maybe I makes it possible that we are still on Earth.
No, but it's really, if you look at all the people who really believe that digital neurons will be able to do this in whatever way, neurosymbolic or neural nets or whatever LeCun wants or what Sutskever wants or whatever. Personally, I think they don't have a chance. They will have a chance to produce actually really useful stuff, which doesn't need to be as good as that. There's value in that cheap clothing that we wear, right? Even if it's cheap.
All right, Gerben, thank you so much. It was a really, really interesting talk, and I understood very much during this talk how this works and how you can use it. I will put all the links that you talked about in the description of the video that the the viewers can look it up.
Thank you.
And yeah, then we will read and see each other in the future.
It was fun. Thank you for having me. As you can experience, I love to talk about this stuff. We haven't covered a lot of things, but it's fun. It's actually these kind of boundary things. It's really fun. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.